It's like... Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming in. Before I start, can everybody just put the phones on silent? Thank you. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the AA Reinier de Graaf, and for his lecture tonight titled The Risk of Realism. Reinier joined the little-known office of OME back in 1996, and OME is known today as the epitome of a truly global architectural office and larger architectural and culture center. So indeed, the topic of globalization and cross-cultural expansion has been a recurrent theme in the work, and predominantly in Reinier's focus, in the writings and research of OME, which is systematically examined and not only embodies the consequences of this early 21st century condition. So I mention this today because of the realities of globalization, like OME as an entity today, with offices in Europe, in Asia, and North America, can be seen nonetheless as a kind of practice that brings a decidedly European vantage to this kind of architectural experience and project today. So in a way, it's another way of introducing one of the significant things Reinier has brought to OME for nearly 20 years. And that includes a significant and extended exploration of the defining features of Europe and the European city in our time. Today, Reinier is responsible for building and master planning projects in Europe, in Russia, and the Middle East at OME, including the new G-Star headquarters in Amsterdam, completed this year, the Staatskantor and City Hall under construction in Rotterdam, the Torstorm residential tower in Stockholm, and the Commonwealth Institute under construction here in London. In recent years, Reinier has overseen OME and AMO's research and projects related to the energy and sustainability. And as he became director of AMO, the think tank within OME, he produced The Image of Europe, an exhibition illustrating the history of the European Union. He's more recently led work on low-carbon Europe as well for the European Climate Foundation, has worked extensively from Moscow, overseeing OME's master plan for the Skoldovo Center for Innovation and many other projects. Reinier has taught research studios at Strelka, the Berlage, and is currently a visiting critic at PennDesign and at the University of Pennsylvania. Reinier's lecture this evening, titled The Risk of Realism, explores the larger cultural and not only intellectual challenges facing architects and many others in a world increasingly drawn into the supposed real problems of our time. Shumi wanted me to say as well for after the talk, there's a piece by Reinier in blue, sorry? There's a piece by Reinier in the new blueprint, which for this evening is a giveaway, usually priced at 30 pounds, so I encourage you to look at the work that's on show in there. Please welcome me please join me in welcoming Reinier de Graaf.
Thank you, Natasha, for a very flattering introduction. I'll be showing none of the projects you mentioned. Thanks to the AA for inviting me here. Thanks, Shumi Bosa. I basically like to start with the picture with which we have started essentially every single talk for the last 15 years, with a firm promise that this evening will be the last time I will ever show it. This is the picture we drew somewhere in 2000 in a way to summarize the world in which we work. A work no longer per se dominated by ideological opposites, but a world united in the consensus over economic values, and essentially a world driven by money as the only remaining source of consensus, and apparently the only remaining source of unification. All of this started with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. 2 weekends ago, it was exactly 25 years ago that happened. And generally this fall of the wall is attributed as a success of the West. This was Ronald Reagan 2 years earlier, with this famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." I'm sure he only uttered that line in the firm conviction that Gorbachev never would, that the wall would remain standing, and that from then on the West could actually claim the wall as a sign of moral superiority for the West. But somehow he did, and the world has changed very drastically since. And the changes of the world have largely been attributed, let's say, to the most vocal proponents of the free market here together in a golf chart. Now, that is one story to tell about globalization, but there is, as to any story, and as in the case of any consensus, always a flip side. Up until 1989, the wall from the other side had served a very different purpose. It was known as an anti-fascist protection wall in the East, and it was supposed to protect a democratic regime from the fascists in the West. That regime was democratic, not because people had the right to vote, but because in true communist tradition, people actually simply ruled, so there was no right to vote. Absurd as that sounds today, that's a whole system span half of the world's hemisphere, and Berlin was the western outpost of something that spanned 13 time zones. That system had its own truth, or its own version of the truth, and its own parallel narrative, with somehow an idea that one could impose his will on economic conditions instead of the other way around. So whenever we attribute, in a way, events since to this man, that man is equally important, and in a way, at least for those who've lived through it, it's very clear that the fall of the wall was partially and maybe mostly created from the East Bloc within. It actually, before Reagan's call, started with talks about disarmament, in which initially the Soviet Union offered unilateral arms reductions, which were resisted by the West at the time. And maybe the most compelling part of the story is that the wall was actually demolished by the exact same people that had built the wall by the East as well. So this is again back to November 9th, 89, the same moment that the talk started with, but with a different story, ending in exactly the same moment in time. I'm telling this story because I've often wondered whether the history of architecture is a similar case, whether a similar story can be told about the history of architecture. This is a very famous moment in architecture. It's not about the erection of a building, but it's about the demolishing of a building. The Pruitt-Igoe housing estate in St. Louis, 1972, which was essentially the demolition of a housing quarter, but which by many critics has been heralded as the end of modern architecture. This is Charles Jenks. Modern architecture died St. Louis, Missouri, July 15, 1972, 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts. When the infamous Pruitt-Igoe scheme was final coup de grace by dynamite, the end of modern architecture. This is an earlier article, Collage City by Colin Rowe and Fred Cutter, 1976. Not only has modern architecture died, but they in particularly see it as the death of whatever view the 20th century had about the city, which is in a way an interesting magnification of what is essentially a seemingly banal act of a demolition of a building, something that happens somewhere in the world probably every day. So the whole thing reached a kind of cult status when actually the demolition of that Pruitt-Igoe estate featured in the film Koyanis Katsi with a soundtrack of music by Philip Glass. But actually, interestingly enough, the housing estate that had been built in 76 was demolished in 1972. So when we got rid of this, through a particular way of writing about history, we also got rid of this, sort of Veel Radieuze. We also got rid of Hilbersheimer's Hochhausstadt. We got rid of the metabolists. We got rid of, this is Louis Kahn in Pennsylvania. We got rid even of those who were essentially revisionists of the modern movement, the Smithsons. We got rid of Jaap Bakema. This is a guy that is actually responsible today, I think, for about 50% of everything that has been constructed in the Netherlands. So half the Netherlands we in a way, also dismissed. And interestingly, the last fantasies of the 1960s were also dismissed. This is No Subsidie bij Argisum, actually an office planned by notorious civil servants from the London Public Works Department, gone. So essentially, a demolition act magnified to the scale of the rejection of almost an entire century. This, in a way, interested us, and it seems a compelling case to look below the rubble of that demolished block to see what is actually there. So let's play the film back, and let's see what really happened. About 2 years ago, there was a documentary. It was a film made by Chad Friedrichs in the United States, which is actually an interesting film in a sense that it interviews a lot of the former residents, and particularly residents of the early years, which casts a rather interesting different picture on the whole estate than we know it. But we, not necessarily departing from a human interest point of view, we have tried to reconstruct the political circumstances that led to the demolition, and therefore we go back to the 1930s, the district enumeration map. It's a census map from St. Louis showing a population of about 850,000. During that census, the city was assumed to grow, but already from the 1930s to the 1940s, St. Louis showed a kind of weird decline in population number. Nothing drastic, and in a way, nothing to get overly worried about. You see it, but the kind of thing was that the trend nevertheless persisted. This is the thing going through the war till after the war, while the USA is still showing an upward curve. Illinois lags behind the USA, Missouri lags behind the USA, St. Louis lags behind Missouri. And there was a trend that started in the 1930s and 40s, where through slum regeneration, highway overpasses, etc., an increasing number of people left the city, and that was void by a rather poorer class of people which came into the city, in a way settled in districts immediately around the town center, to a point that they actually started to pose a problem to the whole real estate market of St. Louis at the time. In 1947, a Republican mayor, Kaufman, commissioned an urban plan which was actually based on soliciting the initiative from the private sector in trying to gentrify the circle of neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown. This is one of these plans in the larger structure plan. The De Soto Car neighborhood, an interesting plan, 3-story buildings in a park-like setting. I mean, almost a kind of contemporary ACOM urban design. That was to be built there. This is actually the same land in which the Pruitt-Igoe estate is located. Then in 1949, something else happened. The United States Housing Act was passed by President Truman, which in a way unlocked federal funds for the creation of affordable housing throughout the United States. It was very precise about the sums it unlocked. It was rather grand in its ambition. It was generous in terms of its funding, but it was specifically vague as to where that housing was supposed to be built, which in a way led to the fact that this Housing Act was taken by many as a reason for many different purposes. By then, St. Louis had a different mayor, Joseph Dast, a Democrat, who basically had made it his mission and his political legacy to be that he would revert the decline of population in Detroit, bring the city back amongst the major cities of the United States. And he used the Housing Acts and the fund of the Housing Acts to essentially embark on a grand scale redevelopment of the center in a high density. This is a chief town planner called Harold Bartholomew, basically drawing aggressively a densification of the center, simply assuming an amount of inhabitants larger than 1 million, so a vast increase of the population. I mean, that kind of hubris is in a way well illustrated in a famous statement by Mayor Darst, "We'll take Manhattan." In a way, the embrace not only of density but also of high-rise, the embrace of a skyline in what you could call, in a way, an early friendly sort of competition of cities. So, in a way, the public housing that was, in a way, started by the Housing Act started to play a role in that, and from there also the notion of high density and high rise. The city commissioned Leinweber, Yamasaki as architects for a new housing development with actually higher densities than the neighborhoods it replaced. Minoru Yamasaki is, of course, a very well-known architect because he's also the architect of the World Trade Center in New York. He is arguably the most important architect ever, since he hasn't made one building that went into history. He's made 2 buildings that are important historic moments, not necessarily because of their architecture, but because of their demolition. The World Trade Center lasted for nearly 30 years. Pruitt-Igoe actually lasted for less than 20 years. So he got to work. 33 11-story slabs, housing about 2,700 units with a district with a population of about 15,000 people. Initially, actually presented and marketed with a great degree of confidence. Initially received by the architectural press with praise. This is the Architectural Forum, who actually praises the slum surgery in St. Louis, praises the skip-stop elevators, the glazed galleries, etc., etc., etc. So initially a kind of very optimistic beginning. The name Pruitt-Igoe is actually a very interesting fact. It is named after Wendell O. Pruitt, a black former serviceman from St. Louis, and William Igoe, a former US congressman also from St. Louis. This area was planned in 1951. At the moment, the United States still knew racial segregation. The blacks were supposed to live in the Pruitt part, the whites were supposed to live in the Igoe part. But by the time of its completion, the Brown versus the Board of Education decision had been passed by the Supreme Court in 1954. And in 1956, this was actually from a segregated neighborhood, a mixed neighborhood. This is the opening, as you can see here. Fair amount of black, fair amount of white people, and predominantly a lot of people and a lot of interest for this new development. And it's important to say that this whole development knew also a number of very good years. There was about a 97% occupancy rate in 1957. And actually, at the time, this line from another documentary wasn't that far-fetched. A cure for the disease. Pruitt-Igoe will rise above the polluted slums, lifting its residents out of poverty. Typical kind of modernist rhetoric. Here in the bright buildings on spacious ground, they can live with indoor plumbing, electric light, fresh plastered walls, and other conveniences that are expected in the 20th century. The Friedrich films interviews, as I said, a number of residents who are invariably almost emotionally optimistic about the initial years. Beautiful place, a big hotel, resort, I'd say, etc., etc. Now, at the same time, in the 1950s, another trend started in the United States. That was the trend that a large number of people who had the means were actually leaving the city, because outside the city, a vast number of actually cheap suburban homes was being built. Those suburban homes were made possible by the exact same Housing Act that had also subsidized the high-rise projects in the American city centers. So in a way, the Housing Act was like a double-edged sword that partially eroded some of the things that started in the city center. Now, the suburban way of life, of course, firmly embedded in the United States since the 1950s. idealized through TV series in the 1950s with women that invariably look happy, that are also invariably white. But there is a dark side to all of this, and perhaps I should say a white side. If colors move in and drive real estate's values down, it's bound to create tension. I think that goals are mixed marriages and being equal with whites. That's one of the ladies. Well, I just couldn't live beside them. One of the main reasons I moved here was because it was a white community, and it's the only place I intend to live. That had, of course, very predictable results, in the sense that you could say that the racial segregation, which has been demolished by the Supreme Courts a couple of years earlier, was in a way, because of the larger geography, reinstated on a larger territory. It was in a way the market, the housing market, that could in a way reconfigure the same type of segregation on a larger territory without breaking a single law. Now, the effect on St. Louis was predictable. By the 1970s, that population of 850,000 was cut in half. In the inner city, an increasing amount of apartments became available, and of course that set up a whole set of projects like this for an almost impossible fight against urban flight. In 1969, there were about 2,500 people left of the initial 12,000, which means that the whole thing was about 3/4 empty. Now, this is partially a building that is vacated, of course then runs the risks of crime, no more social control, and increasingly poor. That situation got so bad that in the 60s it made the national news. It was voiced wide over the press, which of course didn't really help things. And on top of that, the architectural press, the same magazine that appraised the whole design in 1951, in 1965 retracted all of its earlier praise. The same design features that it had praised in the earlier edition were simply retracted in the second edition, and in fact blamed for, in a way, all the problems that went on there. On top of that, in the late 1960s, the whole mood against these projects swang. The whole political climate against big spending in government started to sway. Government no longer has an open checkbook, and at that moment, the maintenance money, which up until then had been paid for by federal funds ruled in the Housing Act, was reverted, and it actually had to come out of the rent of tenants. Now, with ever fewer and ever poorer tenants, that started to pose a massive problem and contributed significantly to the decline of this thing. Towards the end of the 60s, the estate had a brief kind of political momentum in the form of a rent strike in 1969. As tenants, we got to draw a line and say no more. Taking the petition to the town hall, which was probably the summum of the estate's fame, a kind of occupy by the tenants. But still, the mood was such. Public housing seen increasingly un-American as a communist erosion of the free market, so the result, in a way, was predictable. Now, that is, in a way, another story which actually leads to the same moment that Charles Jenks describes in his book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. He gives it his legacy. This whole thing casts a somewhat different light on the whole thing, but the point of this is not so much a kind of petty bickering between historic interpretation. The point of this only becomes interesting when you start setting it off to the situation today. This is St. Louis today. As a matter of fact, this is the Pruitt-Igoe estate, a somewhat quaint urban forest that stands at the place where the housing estate once was. But not only the housing estate is gone, as a matter of fact, the whole city has gone. This is almost like looking at a picture of a Siberian bit of countryside. Boarded up warehouses, a kind of desolate urban wasteland, Pruitt-Igoe to the right here. And of course, since it is America, the only thing that's left standing is a church. but largely a church with no more community to cater for. And the whole thing becomes actually most staggering if you compare an aerial photograph taken in 1968 to an aerial photograph taken in 2014, where actually the comparison of these two images indicate an entirely different problem. It doesn't necessarily indicate a problem of a housing estate that is fighting a losing battle. It actually indicates the problem of the city that is fighting a losing battle. Why we need to fix St. Louis. I think it's quite interesting that at one point a city embarks on the demolition of homes to only then find itself at the top of the ranks of actually the rise in homelessness in the United States. 14% in 2012 in Missouri. Those official numbers, anyway, are only a tip of the iceberg. It's a kind of hidden epidemic. And this particular documentary, the Hidden Homeless, actually discovers that probably the official numbers are about a third or a fourth of the real kind of homelessness in the city that is accounted for. A very interesting thing. Demolition of a housing estate in one period, excessive homelessness in another. The demolition of Pruitt-Igoe was supposed to get rid of crime. The 10 most dangerous city in the US, I don't know what is happening. As St. Louis, actually with violent crime, the largest predominant city in the US. Crimes that are particularly linked to the city center, anything, this is a kind of overview, anything from assault to shooting, anything from burglary to robbery, etc., etc. Now, with largely a middle class gone, the city has a very feeble tax base, and the municipal authorities are in permanent need of money. So, interestingly enough, crime, rather than a problem, also becomes a source of revenue. This is an article that shows that the St. Louis police have an active policy encouraged by the municipal authorities to, in a way, find anything from loud music to noise ordinance violation, uncut grass, unkept property, to even wearing saggy pants, as in a way to substitute for the loss of a fiscal revenue base. Because of that, or despite that, or for whatever reason, St. Louis was awarded in 2012 the IBM Smart City Grant for its original policies on crime fighting. Now, this is very interesting because this essentially means that IBM largely gave an award to itself, because IBM was the city's preferred consultant under a Smarter Cities program to actually advise the city on crime and to use digital technology to combat it in the form of a chief coordination officer that stops crimes before they occur, which you call the Moneyball approach.
I used to think my job was all about arrests, chasing bad guys. Now I see my work differently. We analyze crime data, spot patterns, and figure out where to send patrols. It's helped some U.S. cities cut serious crime by up to 30%. By stopping it before it happens. Let's build a smarter planet.
Yeah, ludicrous. This is part of an interesting trend because this is about a computer company fighting crime, which they euphemistically refer to as an involvement in public safety. But that's not the only thing they cater to. I mean, this is that same IBM Smart Cities program. It caters to healthcare, energy, education, social services, transport, etc. And IBM isn't the only one. There's basically every single company from Microsoft to Schneider to Siemens, Cisco, who are now involved with the city and involved with more or less taking on public tasks. These are their missions. urban areas, amount of data, health and safety, energy, and here overcrowding, pollution, resource constraints, inadequate infrastructure, and the need for continuing economic growth. Now, that is quite a responsibility for a digital tech company to take on. But first and foremost, this is part of another interesting trend. I mean, in terms of city governance, we used to have a number of public tasks, which you can list here. But I mean, if you take the sum total of competences that these tech companies supposedly offer, you actually get this, an increasing privatization of a number of public tasks by tech companies who are clearly in there, not necessarily for the greater good, but in the end to sell products. Now, that privatization has also not passed St. Louis by, and of course privatization means that some people do very, very, very well out of it. 5 Missouri billionaires make up the Forbes 400 rich, most noticeably and most notoriously the Anheuser Busch family, which is a beer company. Well, it's actually a beer monopoly by now, based in St. Louis, in a headquarters in St. Louis that looks suspiciously like a beer bottle. Actually, interesting thing is that Charles Jenks quotes St. Louis as the death of modern architecture, but you can also see that in terms of postmodern architecture, that wave hasn't been particularly generous to St. Louis. This is a kind of a revenue statement or the capital of the Anheuser-Busch family, and that really becomes interesting once you start to compare that kind of money to the annual budget that, for instance, the St. Louis municipalities have to spend on public safety, essentially more than 500 times larger. And this kind of money flight is, of course, a problem in terms of city management, blatantly a problem, to the point that the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, actually, even a bank deems that wealth inequality as a major problem in US cities, which in a way brings me to another book that was recently written by a French economist, Thomas Piketty, with a lot of American experience at MIT, who basically has made an interesting economic analysis of the current moment. And an economic analysis that is so simple and so blatant that you basically wonder why nobody's discovered it before. He compares the return on labor to the return of capital. And essentially, once the economy reaches a moment that the return on capital becomes larger than the return on labor, there is no hope at all. By working, you can only get poorer. No matter how hard you work, there is no way of ever making up the discrepancies, the inequalities that prevail in society, because the clock and the meter will always be ticking harder with those who have the money than with those who are trying to obtain it. He's basically analyzed these categories over a long, long period of history, since the beginning of our count of years, and basically has discovered an interesting trend in the sense that the 20th century was maybe the only period in history where that wasn't the case, where in a way you earned more by working than you earned by having, which was also the period of great social mobility, of a form of social justice. Now, if you zoom in on that period and you start to look at more detail, something interesting starts to occur. This is the period indicated where actually the return on working was harder than the return on capital. These are the main urban utopias that I showed in the earlier part of the lecture. If you make these part of the timeline, you see that in a very interesting way they coincide with that economic period. This is Pruitt-Igoe, 1972. That had a very interesting effect on the confidence of the architectural profession, in as much as before they made plans, they made utopias Afterwards, they mostly wrote books reflecting on the nature of the city, but still a very active and engaged period of thinking. So after 1999, and you more or less see that that period of larger wealth than capital is cluttered with thinking about the city, and thinking about the city in a very idealistic way, where the city is a tool of emancipation for people. Now, zooming out, again, you see what kind of petty, poxy little period in the longer run that is, that maybe architecture only had that role in history, only had a certain social mission in history for a very, very brief moment in history. That period essentially runs from 1914 till 1989. From the shot in Sarajevo, the beginning of World War I, till the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The most important architectural manifesto written in 1940 was the Futurist Manifesto, published in the Figaro. The most predominant architectural manifesto of 1989 was A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles. And that is, in a way, very, very interesting. Essentially, from the blooded uniform of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, we move to the red decorated uniform of the Prince of Wales. So that's the end of aristocracy, and in a way the beginning of a new aristocracy. So what is the significance of this period between 1914 and 1989? It may as well not have existed. As a matter of fact, if we eliminate it, we can simply happily continue the natural asymmetric tendencies of the financial system, where in a way having is simply more rewarding than working. These men have many things in common. They're both feverish hunters, and they share a passion for architecture. We know that. This is the Belvedere in Vienna, linked to Buckingham Palace in a kind of seamless transition and a kind of happily ever after. So what does it mean? From 1914 to 1989, we had utopia. We all know the associated risks. We all know the damage, and we all know the dangers. But what did we have before, and more importantly, what will we have after? Before we have feudalism, what will we have after? So this is 1925, a utopian plan Voisin by Le Corbusier, firmly in the 20th century. This is its 21st century equivalent. At first sight, it doesn't look that different. I mean, it's got a more interesting, a more varied skyline, but it's essentially high-rises united by a grid of streets. But there is one significant difference. The previous image is drawn by an architect, and this image is actually made by McKinsey, or at least it's on the cover of a McKinsey report of Mumbai. McKinsey will turn Mumbai, with its seemingly insurmountable problems, into a world-class city in a 10 to 15-year time frame, and this report aims to show the way to do just that. How can you do that? You either have to be very fast, or you can actually do it by cultivating a certain amount of blindness. And that is increasingly what many of these visions tend to do. They are not necessarily urban visions, but often economic analyses, often summing up the city in terms of a series of measurable performances, whereby they strategically prioritize those performances that actually helps them raise on the lists that are increasingly made about cities, and which are in a way increasingly made about the competition of cities, the so-called livable cities list. So it is in a way an analysis and a strategy for Mumbai to rise on that list. But what does that actually mean? Because that list is topped by Vancouver, Vienna, Melbourne, Perth, etc., etc. One actually would wonder why anybody would want to be on the top of that list. But anyway, a series of cities, we all know the name, with a list with the top 10, a list with the bottom 10 of cities that are supposedly least livable. But if you look here, there is of course simply the distinction between rich and poor cities. There is simply the distinction between cities who grow in terms of GDP, and cities that grow rapidly in terms of population. And if you take the same Piketty analysis and you apply it to the city, you get a same kind of tragic thing. Let's say you compare GDP growth and population growth. The X in between ventures to either side. As soon as you have more population growth than GDP growth, actually your livability goes down. The sooner you have more GDP than population growth, your livability goes up. So in a way, this is in a way a list between GDP and population, which means that invariably on that side of the city, that also the city will be an increasing source of inequality. The more we aspire to this, the more we get this in return. Now, at the time of Pruitt-Igoe, or in the last century, there was a division between rich and poor, whereby the poor was something that needed to be addressed. Increasingly in all of these plans, that has morphed into the included and the excluded. And the excluded have one major advantage in the sense that they can be ignored and forgotten, to the point that in a way this is in tandem with this is in tandem with that. That is the Rio-Panama and even at the US border. So 25 years after the collapse of the wall, there is a very interesting situation. That whilst the wall between the two dominating political ideologies has disappeared, there is a whole set of other walls which in a way are invisible, but which in a way harbor a much greater contrast than this wall ever did. I would like to read some old writing by Baudrillard. This bit is about the American highways. To the person who knows the American freeways, the signs read like a litany. Right lane must exit. This must exit has almost struck me as a sign of destiny. Sorry, he's French. I've got to go. I've got to expel myself from this paradise, leave this providential highway which leads nowhere but which keeps me in touch with everyone. This is the only real society or warmth, this collective compulsion of lemmings plunging suicidally together. Why should I tear myself away to revert to an individual trajectory, a vain sense of responsibility? If America is resuscitated, it knows only the self-evidence of wealth, the tautology of power, which it magnifies to the dimension of the nation or indeed the whole world. The have-nots will be condemned to oblivion, to abandonment, to disappearance pure and simple. This must exit logic. Poor people must exit. The ultimatum issued in the name of wealth and efficiency wipes them off the map, and rightly so, since they show such bad taste as to deviate from the general consensus. If you go back in time, and you revert back to the Berlin Wall, there is a situation that if you show the other half, you have the other side of a wall, but you have a side that doesn't look that different. And that is in a way ironic. There is a wall, but there is a more or less similar condition still in the 70s on either side. This is another picture from the Venice Biennale this summer. This is Pyongyang and Seoul. Seoul and Pyongyang. In many of the cases, you get it wrong as to what is where. High-rise in Seoul, high-rise in Pyongyang, to the point that there is actually a strange similarity on either side there. Well, with a little bit of imagination, that in a way revokes that Berlin moment. I'd like to end on 2 weekends ago when the fall of the wall was celebrated its 25th anniversary. And in a way, end on a kind of political note. This was the world in 1989. This was part of the world that was democratic and part of the world that was not. The part of the world that was not was mostly communist. And we always assumed that after the fall of the wall, the amount of blue would increase at the expense of the red, that we would have more democracies and fewer dictatorships. Today, that is only partially the case, because there has been the emergence of an interesting third category. This is in a way our admittedly somewhat simplistic political analysis of the world. In the blue, you have democracy, there you have elections. In the red, you have dictatorship, there you don't have elections. And in the yellow, you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. And that's an increasingly successful political system in the sense that it provides an alternative to dictatorships to seem democratic, but at the same time it also provides a very dangerous erosion to established democracies to show ever more autocratic tendencies. And I deliberately say we architects work a lot in the yellow. And in that sense, in the current discourse, there is even an interesting celebration of the yellow in the architectural profession. This is an interesting discussion on the finishing of Terminal 5 and how long it took, and the complaints of architects over the lengthiness of democratic procedures. This is Foster. We're in a state of denial while they, the Chinese, are making decisions in the spirit of the Victorians. They have the courage to try it. What attracts me about China is that there's still a state. There's something that can take initiative on a scale and of a nature that almost nobody we know to do could ever report or contemplate. I don't know who this is. The more centralized the power, the less compromises need to be made in architecture. The directions are clearer. Peter Eisenman in the New York Times recently. Democracy is obviously not something we want to get rid of, but it does create chaos. I mean, the guy next door can just do what he wants, and it creates collision of thinking in cities. It means people build whatever they want. That's Frank Gehry, of all people. Some of the most amazing places were built because of dictators. Architecture is always related to power and related to large interest, whether financial or political. Bernard Tschumi. And this one I think is priceless. I think the best thing to have is a benevolent dictator who has taste. So if it's up to them, if it's up to the usual suspects that are at the peak of our architectural profession, what will be next? Will it be the case that the yellow will be so fortuitous and successful that it will take over the whole world? Is that our new consensus? And is that still a consensus that we would want to say yes to? Thank you. In a truly democratic fashion, I refuse to answer any questions.
Really? Oh. Thank you very, very much. I think what's really interesting is the kind of beautiful expose and narrative that you've drawn across the globe, but that begins and ends with Berlin, but actually begins and ends with the model of the currency, I think more than the map. And to bring it back to Europe in a sense, because I know that's also predominantly been your focus for quite a long time, what does this do for us in Europe? What is our critical realism that we're facing today, and how do we as architects begin to address it? Or do we just kind of push for yellow?
I don't know. I don't think Europe is particularly relevant. Or not more relevant than any of the other parts of the globe. I think there is an interesting comparison. If you read Piketty, it is not a very optimistic view because it's not a very optimistic view because in a way it shows a kind of fatalism that no matter how big your endeavor, no matter how hard you work, no matter how good your intention, there is an automatic default in the system which simply perpetuates no matter what you do. And I think that's the same case for architects. I didn't mean to be nasty with the last quotes, and I particularly included one of, us, I'll say us, in it because there seems to be a systemic logic at play that also, even if you do a good building, it doesn't escape the logic. We used to build buildings. We have still a discourse about their function, but to 9 out of 10 clients, buildings are actually a means to an end. They are a speculative investment. We used to make buildings. We currently contribute to real estate, whether we like it or not. Those buildings are one of the prime drivers whereby capital actually pays dividend. And I don't know what you can do apart from developing a very astute political agenda that at least makes you aware of it, because I guess to be aware of a problem is the first step in addressing it. And I really don't think that is any different in Europe than it is in the US, China, or wherever. I mean, the weird thing of all the systems, whether they're democratic or non-democratic, is that this divergence seems to be at play irrespective of the political form of governance. And it's also not so strange because, I mean, the more dividend is generated by capital, the less money there is in the public sphere. I mean, the more and more, in a way, money escapes from democracy, even to the point that a democratic decision process becomes marginal, because most of the money operates outside of it. And so I don't know, but I don't mean to be pessimistic.
As another kind of anecdote, I'm sure you know about the Pruitt-Igoe, one of the other contributions to the social demise and the kind of structural architectural demise of the project, in the end, was quite a few of the buildings were women and children only.
Yeah.
And so that also then, as this kind of social policy that as an architect you have absolutely no control over.
Right,
I mean, it limited the engagement of men in the buildings, it criminalized male presence within the buildings, and so all of a sudden
But I mean,
poor families becoming poor.
there's an interesting reason for that, because it was not that the building was inhabited by single mothers. It was even when people were married, when there was an able-bodied man as part of the occupants of the apartments, if there was an able-bodied man, they didn't qualify for any form of support. So the moment you didn't have a job, but you were an able-bodied man and you could work, you lost whatever kind of welfare or social provisions there were. So people also artificially separated in a way to keep on going, which was one of the flaws of the system.
So what's the next diagram, or what's the next YES? Because now you've promised that that doesn't reappear.
Yeah, so I don't know.
Where'd it go?
Yeah, wait, it's there. I don't know. But I guess the interesting thing about the diagram was that it sort of more or less accidentally came about. I don't know how. I think as a joke. But then we had an intuitive sense that it was compelling and pregnant with some sort of meaning. And in a way, every time we've shown it, it's also like a little bit of the meaning is unveiled to us. I mean, we show it, it's the same image, but it acquires a slightly different meaning every new time you show it. And in this sense, I feel that by now, probably our progressive insight is such that its mystery is gone for us, so then it's time to start with something else.
Can I open up to questions from the floor?
I find it very interesting that you think that the ultimate message of Piketty is a pessimistic one, because if going through what he writes, I believe that he proposes at the end of his book the idea of a tax on wealth, which is nothing short from naive, I think. So I don't see that as pessimistic, but rather as a naive approach.
No, it's a very evident approach, and maybe they are naive. But the reason why I find it pessimistic is because what we've done, and I'm not an economist, but I mean, I find this book appealing because I understood it, which is such a rare delight to get when you're when you look at other professions. But anyway, the depressing part, or the somewhat daunting part for us, is that what we've done is in a way compare the history of architecture and in a way compare it to the economic tendencies that he analyzes in his book. And there is an almost miraculous coincidence whereby, if the 20th century was an exception and an anomaly, it's a weird thing. I was born in 1964. I left university in 1989. So my entire education, my entire view of the world is actually calibrated by a period that is evidently an anomaly in history. My whole architectural education was all about the stuff that I've shown that is apparently an anomaly in history. And if not depressing, I have to say that I find this revelation somewhat disorienting at best,
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree. I think the point for me will be to be how do you translate those results or that analysis of understanding that time period in time was nothing but an exception, and you flip it around and try to understand how to turn it into a positive argument
Yeah, I know.
against it.
So that is a big challenge.
And I think that's, in a certain way, we're kind of missing that.
Yeah, but I
tonight.
mean, I'm not of the school in any way, and this is a particularly Dutch thing as well, that if you have an analysis, you also need to have a solution. I believe there can be some space between the two, but where I actually disagree, I mean, you may think, because Piketty proposes to charge wealth and to ease off on a tax on income, which you may call naive, but which in a way is a logical outcome of his analysis. And I also think that if it's not that solution, something needs to be done about the fact that an ever larger proportion of money and capital simply moves away from outside the democratic system. You know, when you reduce government, as has been the trend since 1980, or since 1980, ever more, government has also ever less to spend. When government has less to spend, actually what you vote for in a democratic system has less and less money to spend, can do less and less and less, and thereby your vote is ever more meaningless. So to kind of find a way to bring back capital within a form of democratic control, I think is urgent. And there's enough science of that being urgent.
If I can reply to that, just to close. The reason why I find it naive is because his proposal implies the existence of a state that has the ability of controlling those mechanisms, which, if it indeed exists, or we're able to create it, then half of the job is already done. But we're far from it. That's why I find it so naive.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that a solution is difficult in the current circumstance, he even recognizes that. You know, but the fact that the solution is difficult because something you need you no longer have doesn't necessarily make the solution fraught, as far as I'm concerned. It's just, you know, he says, I'm an economist, and this is what I can propose. And of course that has a trickle-on effect, that you do not only change the economy, it requires a recalibration of the political system.
I don't want to ask you a question about what's next. I think you've been very clear. I mean, and anyone who's maybe read William Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire knows exactly where we're headed. My question really is a more pragmatic one. And as architects, we're very good at designing or using different parameters in order to inform our design. We're very sensitive to materiality, to space, to technology, to environmental conditions. And yet, we never consider finances as a primary driver of design, or indeed, let's say we never think about financial architecture, which underpins architecture. And I just wondered why you thought that might be, and even, I mean, within the role of OMA, AMO, if you would apply your energies towards devising financial mechanisms to reverse the processes that you've described.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're very right. I mean, because, I mean, architects, the less they build buildings, the more they tend to develop an interest in other domains, and some architects do both. But it is the case that in a way, to treat finances as a subject of design is curiously absent in the architectural profession, and there is almost a sort of laziness in terms of simply regarding that as something you can craft and do something with, and there is a strange surrender to the powers to be. In the office, I think actually about 80 to 85% of our economy, also in our office, is earned in a very traditional way, you know, where you get a percentage of the construction cost, that's your fee, that's it, no matter how much a building earns, no matter what the economy that building is part of. If you propose a budget cut, you actually cut your own fee, and all the kind of curious dilemmas there, I think, and this goes to the core of the subject, what you find is that the current economy disproportionately rewards risk. It doesn't reward hard work, and architects are still in the category of hard work. And I think it would simply, I mean, to craft the economy, to craft the financial aspect, would introduce a level of risk in the business of architecture in order to, A, do better for themselves, but to also to have more influence on the finances. But that is a step that is actually very, very hard to take, because, I mean, it takes money to make money. I had a curious discussion in Venice last weekend. Sorry for this sort of detour anecdote. With a very young architects practice who actually worked on the basis where they would share in the success of their design, you know, as a kind of a reward model. And then it all went very well. They refurbished an existing building for a client. They rented a floor themselves. And then if the rest of the building would become full as a result of their thing, they would be rewarded. Now, the depressing thing was that they were rewarded in terms of workspace for their own office. And you know, that indicates something that it's, I think it's an interesting principle, but the scale of the economy there is such that it also quickly ventures to meaningless. But I think your point about making finances a subject of design is very, very valid and probably very important.
Excuse me for interrupting. My English is not very good, but I graduated this school when you were 2.
When I was 2.
Yeah, I
Right.
graduated
Okay.
the A in 66.
Okay.
And actually I'm here because I'm celebrating my 75 years
Okay.
birthday.
Congratulations.
So,
Congratulations.
and I came to listen to you and I enjoyed very much what you said. And I'd like to conclude something that you didn't say. Actually, what you were saying is that architects shouldn't be neutral. They should join politics. They should join for a better society and not just stay behind and obtain commission from dictators here or there because there is money. They should, in their country, fight to change the government. So, as you said, the government will fight for finance to do welfare for the people. In the 50s and 60s, when there was welfare society in London, there was great social architect. The LCC did unbelievable design. Never again such design was made in Britain. And that was because the political system was different. Then came, as you were very well shown, Thatcher and Reagan and changed the world and killed the welfare society. So what I'm trying to say, and I did it personally, I joined politics. I was the first deputy mayor of Tel Aviv for a while. And I think you should, with your experience and with your very well thought attitude, urge architects not to be neutral, but to join politics, not necessarily practicing, but at least fighting for their ideals. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. That was no question, so I have no answer.
I feel like your talk was a provocation of sorts, that it was a call to arms in a sense, and a kind of provocation to ask us to be political in a sense, or to at least consider these things in a framework where I think many of you now are working in unit projects that may or may not touch on any of these ideas, but it does broaden the conversation, and what it does importantly is really start to set out where you would want to engage as a burgeoning architect, in some cases well-versed, well-practiced architect. Are there any other questions? Then please join me in, oh, what? Go ahead.
I believe that architecture needs to find island of optimism in order to do something.
Well,
every decent project is always sprung from optimism rather than pessimism.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
So my question is, I don't know, whether Don't you think that maybe you're cornering yourself?
No,
In-
I don't think so.
Can I finish?
I don't think so. But I mean, I'm European in the sense that I think, unhappy endings are always far more profound than happy endings. So therefore, whenever I act on a cultural platform, I feel this kind of cultural obligation not to paint any sunny picture. And also, if you go to any conference today, and you talk to Cisco, Google, or whatever, I mean, there is so much naive optimism about the powers to be, about the power of technology, about how soon we will overcome. If you look at a series of TED Talks, and you see all the wonderful solutions, you wonder why the world is in the state we're in. And in a way, what I want to do is create an island of pessimism in that context and single-handedly spoil the party.
But if I can finish the
He
question.
just wants that right side of the slide. He wants the blind.
No, I wanted to create an island of optimism within the island of pessimism that is actually architecture intellectually.
Right, okay.
So can I finish the...
Yeah,
No, because I didn't finish the question.
okay.
No, so the question was whether you're cornering yourself in terms of scale. Like, if you say that all the projects that were developed until 1989, were utopian in terms of scale, trying to find a solution to society and do utopian plans for the city in terms of huge scale, and these have failed, why don't we change scale? Why don't we find optimism in a smaller scale today? That was the question.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, nobody's ever accused me of cornering myself in terms of scale. I also find it an interesting conclusion at the end of this talk, but I don't know. Also there, I have an opposite. If you look at the whole green discussion and the whole sustainability discussion, I am always mesmerized, by the scale of the urgency and the scale of the rhetoric that goes like this, and then the scale of the interventions that goes like this, from cities to houses to caravans to beer tins to ever more meaningless devices, etc. So I don't know. I think the whole problem of the market economy is that the market economy has cornered itself in terms of scale, in the sense that we live in a competitive landscape, in a landscape of partial interest, where addressing grand issues simply is never possible anymore, because there's always the ulterior motive of somebody you're competing to. So not giving away the full story. So I like the large
Why
scale.
don't we act in small scale if the
Yeah.
grand narrative is compromised? Say under Strelka.
Yeah, but I mean, I think then acting in the small scale is a kind of resignation to the compromising of the grand narrative, which at least I'm not prepared to do.
Okay.
But I mean,
I feel like you're trying to be more realistic than pessimistic. So why not use the word realism? Trying to get people to because I feel like, nowadays, studying architecture, I know I'm still first year, but I entered architecture with the intention of wanting to enter the political world, sort of trying to, like the guy in the back said from 66, just trying to change architecture through politics, but just in a realistic sense, not trying to be too optimistic and too pessimistic. I mean, just why the word optimism and pessimism? It's not
well, I
why
didn't
realism.
introduce them. I mean, it's sort of the gentleman behind you.
Yeah.
But I mean, my talk, I believe, is called The Risk of Realism. So I don't know whether I want to advocate realism at this point, but I'm happy, I'm very comfortable with words.
There was a point in the 20th century where you had Foucault and you had May 68, and architecture was viewed as power, and then no one wanted to do architecture because our architecture was a kind of a dictator instrument. And at some point in your lecture and at the OMA's work, you point out that nowadays architecture is a device, and architecture is capital. So you're basically, as an office, you're building capital for someone. So there is a sense that architecture nowadays is as bad as well. So do you think there's a trend to go outside of doing architecture? Maybe an AMO is a piece of that. Do you think that's a trend or not?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to do architecture in as much as architecture is necessary, and that varies considerably in different parts of the world. But I mean, what I've been trying to say, and not to be all out pessimistic, but what in a way I've been trying to say is that, you know, we know the damage the utopias of the 20th century have done, you know, and I in no way want to idealize Pruitt-Igoe. That's not, or Corbusier, or any of the grand visions of them, because the damage is clear. And we are familiar with the damage, but I mean, we are currently in an age where there is so much shying away of that kind of thinking that I think the extremity of that is beginning to form a risk in its own right. And we are familiar with the dangers of utopia. We are not yet familiar with the dangers of a complete, utter denial of utopia, with a complete unwillingness to think big. And I have a feeling that in the coming century, the dangers of that are going to be increasingly clear. So it's all bad.
What you seem to suggest is that architects need to start, in a way, taking the profession more seriously, or not taking the profession, but actually having a vision or having a dream or having an idea or things like that. But I clearly remember someone saying that architecture is, architects take themselves far too seriously, and that they're not, I mean, you know, their value compared to the capital or compared to the land value is very, very little.
Who said that?
Actually, it was you.
Oh.
In a lecture. So I'm quite interested that.
Well, I think it. I mean, yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think it's actually true. I mean, I don't think there's a shortage of taking themselves seriously among architects. But what is your question?
Yes, I was just interested because in modernism, what actually happened was this idea of a vision of a future. No? And that was the entire idea of utopian. But now architects seem to shy away from that idea. That they seem to say that it's not their job to kind of do anything in the world. It's not their job to change things in the world. They have no value. They have no goal. It's a very autonomous profession. So I'm just very interested in that sort of...
I think what has happened is that it's an increasingly safe profession, and that in a way the sense of entitlement and the sense of grandeur has stayed, but that actually the amount of social engagement has diminished. I mean, it's somewhat easier to keep your hands clean when you design an art gallery or any kind of boutique project than when you actually try to address the scale of mass housing. And I think what we have currently, because I mean, I assume that the makers of these utopias were arrogant. And as arrogant as we are today. I think the big difference is that they had something to be arrogant about. Because, I mean, for me, there is no shame necessarily in failed projects. There is, in a way, only shame for not having mobilized every intellectual endeavor in trying to accomplish something. So, and I think that's the difference. Can we have a drink?
Also, Shuey reminds me that there's the blueprint issue with Reinier placing the spotlight, I believe, on Rio's transformation as it shifts from World Cup to Olympics.
Yeah, please take them. I don't want to take them home.
You know, so good. Never had to do that. jump in.
Thank you.